Jean Marshall is an incredibly beautiful 16-inch doll, originally created and designed by Mel Odom and first produced by Ashton Drake. She holds an iconic place in many collections as being the first doll to popularise the 16-inch body form. Although she is no longer currently being produced, I know that many collectors like me hope to see another Jean Marshall revival. Through her years, both with Ashton Drake and with follow-up releases by Integrity Toys and Jamieshow, Jean Marshall continued to evolve, and that meant as also her body evolving with her. All of the Jean Marshall bodies look very similar and share a lot of characteristics, in particular the hourglass shape, which was devised by Mel Odom for his original release. Mel Odom's concept was a glamour film star from the 1940s and 1950s, and both the face and body of Jean Marshall represent this. Her face has the smoky makeup, the defined lipstick, and the sweet traits of a movie star. Her body has a large bust, a narrow waist, and a glamorous silhouette that highlights the clothing she wears to perfection. Jean was first released in 1995 with this body here, and the concept of articulation really didn't exist yet in the fashion doll world. So her body is similar to what we would have seen in a Barbie doll from this era, with just her shoulders, neck, and her hips moving. The articulation of these parts is very simple. The legs simply move forward or backwards, the head can turn but not tilt, and the arms have a slightly better range of motion. This is in line with the articulation we saw at this time. For 5 years, Jean continued with the exact same body, but in the year 2000, we started to see a body transition. The bodies at this time, some dolls were still released with the original straight arm and straight leg body, but slowly a few dolls started to be introduced that had bending knees as well. There were several releases with this body, but it's most commonly seen on the Simply Jean dolls who were released at this time. As you can see from my example here, there was a very common flaw with this body, which was the yellowing of the bending parts. They were made with a different plastic to allow that jointing, and unfortunately, the plastic they used in this era yellows very significantly with time, and it causes the plastic to become brittle. So a lot of dolls with these legs will have yellow legs and, unfortunately, chips at the knees. The advantage to this body was that with the knees being able to bend, this doll was able to sit down and therefore to take poses where she was seated rather than just standing. However, as there is no other articulation, no changes to the joints except for the knees, it honestly didn't allow for a large range of different motion. Also in the year 2000, the third Ashton Drake body was beginning to be seen. The first Madra doll was released in this year, and all Madras have the body that has both bending elbows and bending knees. Most likely, dolls were coming out of the factory with the body dependent on when that doll had been designed. And we were seeing in the year 2000 a range of all 3 of these bodies. But slowly, the transition happened so that all dolls from 2002 onwards were released with this body. Again, there is no significant difference to the body design or jointing except for the addition of the elbow joints here. These joints don't allow for a huge range of motion. If you see how far she bends, you'll see it's only a few centimeters. However, I do find that when this doll is on the shelf, it gives her a more realistic look in terms of how she stands and how she can be posed. It doesn't really allow her for play, but as this is a collector doll, we aren't really looking for play value, but more for posability, for photography and display. The other joint that was added into this doll was the waist joint. So now she can swivel, she can slightly bend her elbows, and she can bend her knees. So she can sit and she can take on a variety of new poses. However, the jointing at the waist is another reason why the plastic was changed, and unfortunately that led to the same yellowing issue on this doll as we saw on this doll's legs. Like the previous doll, The plastic that was used for the jointed parts of this body have a real tendency to yellow, and depending on the release, some of the dolls have very significant yellowing throughout the whole body. You can see the comparison of these two. It seems to be dependent partly on the year they came out and also on the particular release as to whether they will yellow like this or not. When the dolls do yellow, for the bending elbow dolls, it is almost always all parts of the leg, the torso, and the upper arms. The lower arms must have been made with a different plastic. Unlike the doll that only has jointed knees, where we can see only her legs have yellowed, nearly the entire doll here has yellowed. Ashton Drake continued to produce the Jean doll until 2005. That made a total of 10 years, and at that point the contract was up and Mel Odom sought a new company, and this time it was Integrity Toys he began working with. And he signed a 5-year contract with Integrity Toys to produce an all-new Jean doll. From 2006 to 2010, Integrity Toys produced Jean, and for all of their releases, they used the same body. You can see that it is very closely styled on the bending body from Ashton Drake, but with a few specific changes. The most significant is, of course, the jointing. Not only does she have more joints, that being a wrist joint added, but the joints that she does have a much larger range of motion. The upper leg or hip joints here are now rounded, and she can open her legs and move them in a variety of poses rather than just back and forward. Likewise, the elbow joints are rounded and they bend much further, but also in more of a variety of directions. The knee joint bends further than the Ashton Drake knee joint, allowing her to more realistically sit or also make a running or walking pose. The waist joint remains the same, but the definition of her shape around the waist has changed, and she has a more rounded figure on the Integrity Toys release. The thing that most closely resembles the Ashton Drake body, I feel, is her bust, where we have nearly the exact same shape and formation. Comparing the height and build of these dolls and of each part, we can also see that they are nearly identical. So the length of the torso is fairly much identical, as well as the length of the arms and legs, making sure that these dolls will fit all of the same clothing. The early years of the Integrity Toys releases may have come out of the same factory as the Ashton Drake later releases, since we see a very similar yellowing issue occur with the earlier dolls. This doll here is a later Integrity Toys release. This doll here is an earlier Integrity Toys release. And we can see that her entire body, apart from the hands, has turned a shade of slightly sickly yellow. This is incredibly common with these dolls. And again, the most unfortunate thing about this is that it leads to the bodies becoming brittle and very often chipping. There is a process that can be done to reverse the yellowing to an extent and also to make them a little bit less brittle, but it is not always effective. Mel Odom's contract with Integrity Toys ran out in 2010 and he did not renew it. And for the first time after that, there was a hiatus in Jean doll releases before a signing with a new company, this time with the Jamieshow company, who produce Resin fashion dolls. An entirely new Jean body was sculpted and designed by Jamieshow. There are a lot of similarities to the previous releases, but also more differences than in any of the others. The first difference that can be seen is the doll's height. Jamieshow dolls are the first one to be notably different in height, being about a centimetre shorter than the other doll releases. We can see that this mostly comes in the length of the torso, which is a different length. Everything in the torso looks somewhat different. We have two completely different joints. So rather than the waist joint, there is this hip joint, almost like an underwear joint, and there is an underbust joint, allowing this doll to make some realistic human poses by leaning to the side. This also means that the bust design is completely different. And the waist still has an hourglass shape, but is in a slightly different position from on the previous jeans. The construction material is, of course, also completely different. Where this doll was made from plastic, all of the Jamieshow dolls are made from resin. Resin is a much harder material. It has a different, more porcelain-like feel, and also produces different colours and uses a different jointing style. This doll has what we call ball joints, where one piece fits into the socket of the next and is attached by elastic. This allows her to make much more unique and realistic poses in a much greater variety of ways. These are single jointed pieces rather than double jointed pieces, and this means that her range of motion is not as extraordinary as some dolls, but she can move and lock into a whole variety of positions that the other dolls cannot. Her head also has a much greater range of tilt and movement, and the Jamieshow dolls have a new feature, which is that the head cap can be removed in order to give this doll magnetic wigs. She is, of course, the only bald doll up to now. Integrity Toys did release 1 or 2 dolls with wigs, but generally speaking, all the jeans up until Jamieshow had rooted hair, whereas all the Jamieshow dolls wear wigs. Because of the height difference between the Jamieshow doll and the slightly different upper body shape, this is also the first doll who can't necessarily share all clothing with the previous one. Generally speaking, she will fit previous jean releases, but clothing that are made specifically for the Jamieshow doll will not necessarily fit the other dolls. I have found that some of the Sandra Stillwell Presents clothing, for example, is extremely tight and may or may not fit correctly on an Integrity Toys jean. All of these bodies have their advantages and disadvantages, and I wouldn't say that any one body is perfect. The very early 2 are just too hard to make look natural. With those stiff arms, they can't help but look like mannequins. The third Ashton Drake doll I actually really like, even though the articulation and the improvement to that is only extremely modest. She can just begin to take on a pose that looks more natural. So even though she's simply standing and wearing a dress when you have her on the shelf, she can do it in a way that looks like a person, and I really like that about her. The Integrity Toys body fills all the gaps and flaws that were left in the third Ashton Drake body. It looks very natural, can take on a very wide variety of poses, and doesn't just have to be standing stiffly on the shelf. So that body is a really excellent choice. It does have the flaw of the plastic yellowing, so it's important to make sure you look for a later body that looks really good. It's also very hard to find now, unfortunately, because there just weren't that many of these dolls produced. The Jamieshow body is very expensive. This doll, being a resin doll, is in a whole different class of release. There are very few of them. The largest release of any Jamieshow jean was only 300, and most of them are 100 or less. So there are very few, and being resin, it is very pricey to start with. These dolls will generally get $500 to $1,000 per doll, even if they don't have any clothes. When posing it, the body from Jamieshow is beautiful. However, it is also a little bit more difficult than the Integrity Toys body. The elastic tends to become loose. My doll's is a little bit loose, and then the poses are harder to hold. She's also heavier, so she's more apt to fall over. The poses she can take on are extremely natural, if you can get her to keep them. But when the elastic is a little bit loose, she doesn't necessarily keep those poses. And so all in all, the Integrity Toys body can be the easier one to get to hold the poses that you want. But if you want a doll that just looks incredibly natural doing nearly anything, then the Jamieshow doll is that doll.